The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Marcus Eldridge would later remember as the kind of detail that means nothing and everything at once. Tuesday, mid-August, 91 degrees by 10 in the morning. The mail carrier didn't ring the bell or knock, just slid the envelope through the slot the way she always did, and it landed on the hallway floor face up, the return address visible before Marcus even bent down to pick it up. First Ag Capital, Loan Servicing Division. He knew before he opened it. A man doesn't farm for 26 years without developing a specific instinct for which envelopes carry good news and which ones don't. And the weight of this one, the particular cardstock quality, the certified mail sticker, the way his name was printed instead of handwritten, told him everything before the first sentence did. He read it standing in the hallway. Then he read it again, sitting at the kitchen table, because some sentences need to be read twice before the brain accepts that they mean what they say. 30 days. That was the number that mattered. 30 days to bring the operating loan current, or 30 days to liquidate sufficient assets to satisfy the outstanding balance, or the bank would proceed with the legal remedies outlined in Section 4 of the original loan agreement, language that Marcus had signed without reading closely enough, 4 years earlier, in a year when the operating loan had felt like a bridge rather than a noose. Attached to the letter was a list. Equipment valued at the bank's estimate of liquidation price, ranked by priority for sale. The list had been prepared by someone in an office Marcus had never visited, by a person who had never walked his ground or watched his harvest, or understood why the order of that list was, to Marcus, almost obscene in its indifference. First on the list, highest valuation. The item the bank's calculations identified as the fastest, cleanest path to closing the gap between what Marcus owed and what Marcus had. The Massey Ferguson combine. To understand what that machine meant, you'd have to understand what the 4 years before that letter had actually cost Marcus Eldridge. Not in dollars, though the dollars were real and brutal, but in the specific erosion that happens to a man's confidence when the ground keeps taking and the markets keep falling, and every decision that should have worked simply didn't. Marcus was the third generation to farm this land. His grandfather had cleared the original acreage by hand in a decade when that was still how it was done. His father had expanded it through the 70s and 80s, surviving a farm crisis that broke half the operations in the county, holding on through methods that Marcus had only partially understood until he was forced to relearn them himself. When Marcus took over, the operation was 1,100 acres, debt-free, profitable in all but the worst years. He had run it well for almost 2 decades. Then came a sequence of events that, individually, any operation could absorb, but stacked together, across 4 consecutive years, had hollowed out the financial cushion that took 2 generations to build. A drought year that cut yields by a third. A grain price collapse the following season that meant even a recovered harvest sold for less than the cost of producing it. A hailstorm in year 3 that destroyed 400 acres 2 weeks before harvest. An act of God that insurance covered partially and inadequately. And then year 4, the year the operating loan, which had been renewed and expanded each of the previous years to bridge the gap, finally exceeded what the bank's risk model would tolerate without intervention. Marcus had bought the Massey Ferguson combine in year 2 of that stretch, not out of excess, but out of necessity. His previous machine, 22 years old, had suffered a catastrophic engine failure during the worst possible week of an already difficult harvest, and the repair cost exceeded the value of replacement. He'd financed the Massey Ferguson through the same operating loan that was now 4 years later the instrument of his potential destruction. The irony was not lost on him. The machine that had kept the operation alive through 3 of the hardest years in his farming life was now the asset the bank wanted to seize to settle the debt that machine had helped create. Marcus called his loan officer the same afternoon the letter arrived. Her name was Patricia Vance, and she had managed Marcus's account for 6 years with what he had always experienced as genuine professional respect. Not warmth exactly, but the kind of fairness that made the relationship workable even when the news was bad. This call was different. Patricia's voice had the careful, deliberate quality of someone reading from a script that legal counsel had reviewed. She confirmed what the letter said. She explained that this was not a decision she had made personally, that the account had crossed a threshold that triggered automatic review at a level above her authority, that the recommendation to liquidate equipment had come from a risk committee Marcus would never meet and could not appeal to directly. Marcus asked if there was any flexibility. Patricia said the 30-day window was itself the flexibility, that without it, the bank's standard procedure would have moved directly to formal default proceedings. The 30 days was, in the language of the institution, a courtesy. Marcus did not feel the courtesy. He asked directly whether selling the Massey Ferguson combine was truly the only path. Patricia said it wasn't the only path, that the bank would also accept a comparable liquidation of other assets, or a substantial paydown from outside capital, or a restructuring proposal if Marcus could demonstrate sufficient cash flow improvement to support it. Marcus asked what sufficient meant. Patricia gave him a number. It was a number Marcus did not have, had no clear path to acquiring in 30 days, and had not had at any point in the previous 4 years. He spent the first 3 days doing what any reasonable man in his position would do. He called his accountant. He called 2 other lenders to ask about refinancing, both of whom declined even to take a full application once they understood the existing loan status. He called a cousin in Nebraska who had once mentioned, years earlier, that he might be willing to invest in the operation, a conversation that had been casual and speculative at the time, and that Marcus now needed to be neither. The cousin was sympathetic. The cousin was also, it turned out, dealing with his own operation's tight margins that year, and could not produce the kind of capital injection that would move Marcus's situation meaningfully. By day 4, Marcus had confirmed what he already suspected. There was no clean financial solution. The math simply did not work in his favor within the constraints of 30 days. He drove out to the equipment shed on day 5 and looked at the Massey Ferguson for a long time without touching it. He thought about his father, who had survived the 80s farm crisis through methods Marcus had never fully understood until forced to. He thought about what his father would have done, and realized, with a discomfort that sat heavy in his chest, that he genuinely didn't know. His father had never talked about that period in detail, had simply survived it and moved forward, the way that generation tended to handle hardship, privately, without explanation, leaving the next generation to reconstruct the lessons from inference rather than instruction. Marcus did not have his father to ask, but he had the machine in front of him, and the machine, in its way, told him something his father never had the chance to. The combine had a service record. Marcus kept it meticulously. Every repair, every part, every hour, logged in a binder that lived in the cab's side compartment. He pulled that binder on day 6 and went through it page by page, not because he expected to find anything new, but because the act of reviewing it gave him something to do with his hands while his mind worked through a problem that didn't have an obvious solution. What he found, reviewing those 4 years of records, was not a revelation about the machine. It was a revelation about himself. In 4 years of operating that combined through 3 brutal harvests, Marcus had never once had an unplanned mechanical failure during a critical window. Every single breakdown, and there had been several because machines break down, had occurred during planned maintenance periods or low-stakes operational windows, the result of Marcus's own discipline about preventive service rather than luck. That discipline had a value. Marcus had never quantified it before, because quantifying it had never been necessary. But sitting in that shed on day 6, with 30 days narrowing toward a deadline that would strip him of the machine that discipline had been built around, he started doing the math. He calculated what an unplanned breakdown during a critical harvest window would have cost him in each of the past 3 years, based on grain prices and weather windows specific to those years. He calculated what those costs would have been if he'd been forced to rent replacement equipment, the way some neighbors had in bad years, at the premium rates that scarce rental equipment commanded during regional crunches. The number was large. It was, in fact, larger than the amount the bank's risk committee had specified as the threshold for restructuring consideration. Marcus sat with that number for a long time. Then he understood, with the kind of clarity that sometimes arrives only at the edge of genuine desperation, what he actually needed to do. He didn't need to sell the machine that had kept his operation alive. He needed to prove, in language a risk committee could understand, that the machine and the discipline behind it were the reason his operation was still viable at all, and that selling it would not solve the bank's risk exposure, but would actually increase it by removing the single asset most directly responsible for the operation's continued capacity to generate revenue. What Marcus did over the next 9 days was not a financial maneuver in any traditional sense. It was an act of documentation, meticulous, exhaustive, built from the same instinct for record-keeping that had filled that service binder for 4 years. He built a presentation, not a sophisticated one. Marcus was not a man with polished financial modeling skills, but a thorough one, constructed with help from his accountant, and built around a single core argument supported by hard numbers rather than sentiment. The argument was this: the Massey Ferguson combine was not a liability to be liquidated. It was the operation's primary revenue-generating asset, and its operational reliability, demonstrated across 4 years of meticulous service records, directly explained why the operation, despite catastrophic external conditions, had continued to generate enough revenue to service debt at all, however imperfectly. He calculated cost per acre harvested across the machine's tenure. He calculated the opportunity cost avoided through zero unplanned downtime during critical windows. He compared those figures against documented regional averages for rental equipment costs during the same period, sourced from co-op records and elevator data that several neighbors, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to corroborate when Marcus explained what was at stake. He did not ask for sympathy. He did not write about his grandfather clearing the land by hand, or his father's unspoken survival of the 80s, or what the farm meant to 3 generations of his family. He understood, with a clarity that surprised even him, that none of that would matter to a risk committee evaluating numbers in a conference room 400 miles from his kitchen table. What he wrote about was risk, specifically the risk the bank itself was carrying, and how that risk profile would actually worsen, not improve, if the combine was removed from the operation. If Marcus lost the combine, he would be forced to either rent equipment at premium rates during his most critical operational windows or attempt to operate with insufficient capacity, both of which would reduce his revenue-generating capability precisely when the bank most needed that capability intact to recover its existing loan balance. Selling the asset, in other words, would not reduce the bank's exposure. It would increase it. He requested a meeting with the risk committee directly. Patricia Vance told him this was unusual, that risk committee decisions were not typically subject to direct farmer appeal, that the process existed specifically to remove emotional and relational factors from credit decisions. Marcus said he understood that. He said he wasn't asking for an emotional appeal. He said he had a financial argument the committee needed to evaluate on its own terms, and he was asking for 15 minutes to present it. Patricia, to her credit, advocated for him internally. It took 4 days to secure the meeting, 4 days that came directly out of the 30 Marcus had been given, narrowing the window further, adding a specific kind of pressure that made the remaining preparation feel like working against a tide that was actively rising. The meeting happened on day 23. Marcus drove 4 hours to the regional office, wearing a suit he hadn't worn since his daughter's wedding 3 years earlier, carrying a binder of documentation that represented 9 days of work compressed from 4 years of records. He sat across a conference table from 5 people he had never met. None of them had ever visited his farm. None of them had ever operated a combine or understood, in any visceral way, what a critical harvest window actually meant to an operation's survival. He had 15 minutes. He used 12 of them. What Marcus presented was not dramatic. He did not raise his voice. He did not appeal to fairness or family legacy or the particular cruelty of a system that measured 4 generations of work against a single risk model's threshold values. He presented numbers. He walked the committee through the service records, through the cost per acre calculations, through the documented absence of unplanned downtime across the machine's operational history, and what that absence had actually been worth across 3 catastrophic years that would have been substantially worse without it. He presented the comparative rental cost data his neighbors had corroborated. He presented his calculation of the bank's actual exposure under 2 scenarios, one where the combine remained in the operation and continued generating the revenue stream that had, despite everything, kept the loan serviced at some level across 4 difficult years, and one where the combine was liquidated and Marcus's revenue-generating capacity was materially reduced at the exact moment the bank most needed it intact. The committee chair, a woman named Dorothy Phelan, who had been evaluating agricultural risk for the better part of 2 decades, asked Marcus a single question after his 12 minutes ended. She asked him what he was actually proposing in concrete terms as an alternative to the liquidation the original letter had specified. Marcus said he was proposing a restructured payment plan. Extended terms, adjusted to match seasonal cash flow, rather than a flat monthly structure that didn't account for the reality of when grain operations actually generated revenue. He said he was proposing to keep the combine, continue operating at the demonstrated reliability level the records showed, and use the additional revenue generated by an unimpeded harvest season to begin closing the gap the previous 4 years had created. He said he understood this required the committee to trust a financial argument over a simpler liquidation that would close the immediate gap faster, on paper. He said the paper was wrong, and his 16 days of preparation were an attempt to show them why. The committee did not give Marcus an answer in the room. Dorothy Phelan told him the presentation would be reviewed alongside the original risk assessment and that he would receive a decision within 5 business days, a timeline that, when Marcus did the math driving home, would land with 2 days remaining in his original 30. Those 5 days were, by Marcus's own account afterward, the hardest of the entire ordeal. Not because the work was difficult, the work was finished, because there was nothing left to do but wait, and waiting, for a man who had spent 23 days in nearly constant motion, was its own specific kind of suffering. He didn't tell his wife the full scope of what he'd presented, not because he was hiding it, but because explaining it required a level of financial detail that felt almost beside the point in a conversation that was really about whether they were about to lose the operation his grandfather had built. She knew the broad strokes. She knew he'd gone to the meeting. She knew he'd done everything a reasonable man could do. She also knew, the way spouses of farmers tend to know, that reasonable wasn't always sufficient. The call came on day 28. Patricia Vance's voice had a different quality than it had carried on the day the letter first arrived. Marcus noticed it before she said a single substantive word, the particular release in someone's tone when they're about to deliver news they're personally relieved to be delivering. The committee had approved the restructuring, not in full, exactly as Marcus had proposed it. There were modifications, additional reporting requirements, a quarterly review process that would scrutinize his operation more closely than it had ever been scrutinized before, and a requirement that he carry comprehensive mechanical breakdown insurance on the combine going forward, a cost Marcus hadn't budgeted for but immediately understood the logic of. But the core of it held. The combine stayed. The loan terms restructured around seasonal cash flow rather than a flat schedule that had never matched the reality of when grain operations actually generated revenue. The 30-day liquidation deadline, with 2 days remaining, was formally rescinded. Marcus sat in his truck in the equipment yard after the call ended, engine off, for almost 20 minutes before he went inside to tell his wife. Instead, he'd spent those days proving it was the only reason there was still anything left to save. What changed for Marcus Eldridge after that call was not, in any simple sense, a happy ending. The operation still carried significant debt. The quarterly reviews were intrusive and demanding in ways that added a layer of administrative burden he hadn't carried before. The margin for error in his operation, going forward, remained thin enough that another genuinely catastrophic year could reopen the entire crisis. But something had shifted that went beyond the immediate financial relief. Marcus had spent 23 days proving, with documentation rather than sentiment, that the relationship between a farmer and his equipment, the specific accumulated knowledge of a machine's behavior, the discipline of meticulous maintenance, the years of avoided catastrophe that never showed up as a dramatic story because nothing dramatic happened, had real, quantifiable value. Value that a risk committee evaluating numbers from 400 miles away had been prepared to discount entirely until someone forced them to actually look at it. He'd proven it not to the county, not to his neighbors, not even primarily to himself. He'd proven it to an institution that had initially seen his most critical asset as nothing more than the fastest path to closing a balance sheet gap. The Massey Ferguson combine ran that fall through a harvest that was, mercifully, more cooperative than the previous 3 years had been. Marcus finished within his target window, without an unplanned mechanical stop, the same way he had for 4 years running. He logged it in the binder. Same as always. The number in that binder, by the end of that season, told a story that no one in that conference room 400 miles away would ever read in full. But the number itself, the cost per acre, the avoided downtime, the discipline that had quietly kept an operation alive through 4 of the hardest years in its history, was the same number that had saved the machine and the farm and very nearly everything else. Marcus Eldridge had been given 30 days to sell the asset the bank believed was the problem.